Today, we're diving into a really powerful document called the Maiden's Manifesto. It's this passionate, theologically driven call for some pretty profound changes within the Catholic Church, arguing for the full equality of women. So let's get into why it calls itself a fire torch. Okay, so right from the get-go, the manifesto lays out this incredibly stark contrast. It calls itself a fire torch, a symbol of liberation, of enlightenment, and it's deliberately setting itself up against the Malleus Maleficarum, the infamous witch hammer. That was a 15th century text used to justify the brutal persecution of women, and this manifesto sees it as the ultimate symbol of oppression that was sanctioned by the Church. So what's the central problem here? Well, the manifesto argues that there's this deep structural issue, a fundamental contradiction, really, right at the very heart of the Church today. And this slide really gets to the core of it. The argument is that women are, without a doubt, the backbone of the Church. They're the educators, the organizers, the ministers in so many ways. But they are completely shut out from any real positions of authority. The manifesto says this creates a massive credibility crisis. It puts the Church's actions in direct conflict with the very human rights it claims to support. Now, to really understand this call for change, the manifesto digs deep into the history, and the argument it makes is pretty compelling. It says this exclusion, well, it wasn't always this way. It traces how we got from there to here. This timeline really illustrates that whole journey. I mean, look at the early church around 50 AD. You had figures like Phoebe and Junia who were recognized as deaconesses and even apostles. Fast forward to 1200 AD, and you have mystics like Hildegard von Bingen who had this immense, even if informal, authority. But then you see the turning point. In 1486, the Malleus Maleficarum kicks off what the manifesto calls a war on female knowledge. And this trajectory eventually leads to 1994 with the Ordinatio Sacerdotalis, which tried to slam the door permanently on women's ordination. And here's the crucial point. The manifesto argues that this isn't just some social problem or a historical mistake. No, it's a profound theological contradiction that cuts right to the very core of the faith itself. So the manifesto basically confronts all the theological excuses head-on by asking this one very direct question. It's challenging the entire idea that the core message of Christianity is somehow against full equality for women. And the answer it gives is a resounding no. It builds its case on ideas that are foundational to Christianity, that everyone, male and female, is created in God's image, that baptism makes everyone equal in Christ, that Jesus himself was constantly breaking social rules to treat women as equals, and finally, that God's call to serve is sovereign. It isn't limited by human-made categories like gender. This all builds on a really key theological idea. You see, a traditional argument against women priests is that they can't be alter Christus, another Christ, because Jesus was a man. Well, the manifesto completely reclaims this term. It argues that Christ took on human nature, not just male nature. And because of that, the ability to represent Christ comes from our shared humanity, not our biology. Okay, so after laying all this historical and theological groundwork, the manifesto doesn't just stop at critique. It actually proposes a concrete vision for what the future could look like, and it's structured around 8 key demands, which it calls the fire torches. And it's so important to point out, this isn't some fringe position they're taking. The manifesto notes that there is overwhelming support for this among everyday Catholics. Take this data from the recent synodal process in Ireland, which was this huge global consultation. It showed that a staggering 96% of the people who participated were in favor of ordaining women. So here are the core pillars of that vision. The 8 torches are basically a roadmap for reform. And they demand everything from equal access to all ordained offices, yes, including the papacy, to a whole new sexual ethic that's based on self-determination. They call for women scholars and leaders to be fully integrated, and for universal human rights to be formally written into church law to create a real community of equals. The way the manifesto wraps up is really powerful. It doesn't end on a note of anger, but with this hopeful vision for the future. And it does this by reinterpreting one of the most famous prayers in the entire Christian tradition. It brings up the Magnificat, which is Mary's prayer, and specifically this verse. And in the manifesto's view, this isn't just some nice poetry. It's a divine mandate for justice. It's a declaration that unjust power structures, like patriarchy in the church, are going to be overturned by God's action in history. And so the document ends with this powerful call to action. It presents the fire torch as something to be passed on. It's an invitation for everyone, women, men, and non-binary people, to pick up that torch and carry the light forward, to help build a church that actually reflects its own founding message of liberation and equality.
And so, the manifesto leaves us all with this final, provocative question. It asks us to think about whether this vision of a truly equal church is just some impossible, distant dream, or if the theological arguments, the historical precedent, and the massive support from the faithful mean that this is a change that's actually already happening. It's a question for the institution and for every single one of its members.